Okay, if we are live, and I believe we are. So I would like to welcome everybody to the 15th episode of 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. I hope everybody enjoyed watching the Buffalo Bills and Los Angeles Rams game on Thursday night. If we have a few minutes, we'll break into that. But really quickly today, right before the college football week 2 starts here, I'm actually going to break down my top four matchups for today, and then hopefully later next week I'll have Billy join me for episode 16. We'll kind of break down the rest of the week 2 matchups and see which upsets and which teams performed well over Saturday, as well as look over the Sunday and Monday games. And of course, we'll talk about the Bills and Rams game more than likely, with Buffalo making a statement on Thursday night here. Well, let's go ahead and let's break these top four matchups that I individually chose here before week 2 officially kicks off here at 12 o'clock here. But the four games I'm going to break down for us today, we got the number 9 ranked Baylor Bears against the number 21 ranked BYU Cougars, the number 20 ranked Kentucky Wildcats against the number 12 Florida Gators, the Iowa State Cyclones against the Iowa Hawkeyes. That'll be a good one later today. And of course, we have the old USC and Stanford rivalry with the number 10 ranked Trojans going against the Stanford Cardinals. So those will be the four games we'll break down. All right, so let's go ahead and let's break down the first matchup here, and that's going to be between the BYU Cougars against the number 9 ranked Baylor Bears here. BYU entering this game, they're actually entering this game as 2.5-point favorites. I'm actually going to double check that. Did I say the Baylor was the 2.5? Did I have that wrong, or did they have BYU? Let me just check quick, because maybe I put that in wrong, but let me see. Yeah, so now they actually just adjusted it. They said the BYU Cougars are now favored by 4 points in this game against the Baylor Bears in this matchup here. And it's a little surprising, but I think recently I just saw that the Baylor Bears are without 2 of their top receivers going into this game against BYU. So it could be a bit of a fair statement by the Vegas odds, playing BYU as 4-point favorites after opening it up originally as a 2.5-point favorite going into this game here. Overall, though, in this series, this will be the 4th overall matchup between BYU and Baylor in their history. Baylor holds a 2-1 edge in the first 3 matchups in this series here. And talking really quick about both of their head coaches here for the Baylor Bears, you have head coach Dave Aranda, who has a 15-9 record at Baylor in his first 2 years that he has been with the program, and he led the Bears to their first Sugar Bowl win last year since 1956. So a really stellar job that he did last year with Baylor, making an incredible run all the way to the Big 12 championship game last year. And I'm going to touch on that in just a second here. But a fantastic season, though, by Baylor last year, really kind of surprising a lot of people on their run to the Big 12 championship, and of course ending with their Sugar Bowl victory in December. And then, of course, we also have the BYU's head coach, Kalani Sitake. He has a 49-29 record so far in his career at BYU, and he played running back actually for the Cougars from 1997 to 2000. So he's kind of been over a nice period of stretch here for the BYU program. Really, Zach Wilson and some of the other big players that Sitake has been in charge of really molding into the NFL scheme. He has done a really stellar job here at BYU, but this is going to be a fun matchup, though, between both of these schools, really at pivotal points here in their season here early on. Baylor probably on the outside looking in for perhaps a college football playoff bid. BYU, on the other hand, maybe trying to make their statement, for um, their purposes to get maybe a New Year's Six bowl at the end of the season here. Let's go ahead and break down my two offensive players to watch, though, um, in this game here for the Baylor Bears. We have a quarterback, Blake Shapen, who actually played a few games as a backup for the Baylor Bears last year. And, as I mentioned about the Big 12 championship game, I watched that game when he came in as the backup freshman starter, and he probably played better than anybody could have advertised for the Baylor Bears in that game there. But in his first game, though, against FCS Albany in their week one matchup, Shapen was 17 of 20 for 214 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and 1 rushing touchdown while completing 85% of his passes. Again, it's an FCS opponent, but still a nice, solid way to start your sophomore season if you're Blake Shapen. And then going back to that Big 12 championship game against Oklahoma State when Baylor stopped the Cowboys on that great goal line stand that they had late in that game. But Shapen had a pretty decent game in that one. He was 23 of 28, 180 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, completed 82.1% of his passes, and led the Baylor Bears to that victory, which gave them a chance in that Sugar Bowl game, even though Shapen didn't play in the Sugar Bowl game. But he certainly stepped up in a big way for the Baylor Bears last year, and all eyes are going to be on him this year to hopefully get Baylor once again into a little consistency, kind of build on what Matt Rule had developed for a number of years at Baylor, turning that program around. And now Dave Aranda and Blake Shapen are hoping to continue their success here this year in a big win against BYU. Despite missing a few offensive players, it will be Blake Shapen who hopefully will step up tonight and see what he can do for the Baylor Bears. Then as for my offensive player for the BYU Cougars, we have running back Christopher Brooks as my player to watch in this game. He had a nice opening game against South Florida when BYU played them in week one. 13 rushes for 135 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown while averaging 10.4 yards per carry against the USF Bulls in BYU's first game here. And then a little bit of a note, actually, on his previous school that he played for, the University of California Golden Bears. Christopher Brooks had a pretty nice season for them in 2019 with 914 rushing yards and 12 offensive touchdowns that year in 2019 with Cal. That was 6th overall in the Pac-12 in his rushing yards and 5th in offensive touchdowns in the Pac-12 that year for Christopher Brooks. And, certainly it's going to be interesting for BYU standards trying to figure how their offense is going to adjust in this game. Of course, being 4-point favorites, but also seeing how Zach Wilson, ever since Zach Wilson left, trying to see how their quarterback position shapes up here. Christopher Brooks can hopefully take some pressure off them in this game here against Baylor. Excuse me. All right, and then let's finish off here this matchup here with my two defensive players to watch in this game between Baylor and BYU. We have a defensive lineman, Jackson Player, for the University of Baylor as my player to watch here for the Baylor Bears. In his first game of the season, he had 2 tackles, 1.5 tackles for a loss, half a sack, and 1 pass deflection against Albany. But he had a pretty stellar career going on at Tulsa before he transferred to Baylor this offseason. In his previous few years at Tulsa, he had 15 tackles for a loss and 5 sacks with the Tulsa Golden Hurricane in 2021. His tackles for a loss is 15 TFLs. That was second most in the American Athletic Conference last year, and his 5 sacks were 8th in the American Athletic Conference in 2021. And he earned a 2-time first team All AAC selection in 2020 and 2021 with Tulsa. So really a nice pickup there by the Baylor Bears. And really it's been a strengthened school that's really revolved around defense for a long time. Their defense has been top notch over the last several years, and they really proved it in that goal line stand they had against Oklahoma State last year in the Big 12 championship game. And Jackson Player can be hopefully a future 2023 draft prospect if he can show out this year for the Baylor Bears here in this matchup here against BYU, and hopefully for the remainder of the season. And then my defensive player to watch for BYU in this game, it's going to be linebacker Ben Bywater in this game here for BYU. His opening game against South Florida, he had 5 tackles, 2 solo tackles, 3 assisted, and 1 pass deflection against the Bulls in that opener for BYU. And last year with the Cougars, he kind of really stepped up in their independent conference, really being one of the leaders in tackles there. Last year, he had 102 total tackles, including 57 solo tackles last year for BYU, 8.5 tackles for a loss, and 1 sack for the Cougars last year during their run. And that was second most for the tackles, for the total tackles, 102 tackles. That was the second most in the independent conference last year, as well as the 57 solo tackles. That was also second ranked in the independent conference last year. And of course, knowing the independent conference, it's only a few teams there, but certainly a really solid year there by Ben Bywater for the BYU linebacker core last year. And he's going to hopefully step up as a big-time veteran leadership, getting some defense going for BYU, entering this game as a 4-point favorite. Hopefully he can shut down Blake Shapen's offense if Shapen struggles in this game here against BYU. All right, and then before we preview our next game here, I got 2 final quick notes on this matchup here between BYU and Baylor here. For BYU, as I mentioned, this will only be the 4th matchup between both of these programs here, but BYU's only win in this series, though, came back in 1984. That also was in week 2 of that season when they beat the Baylor Bears 47-13 in that matchup there in 1984. And that was that legendary year for BYU when they finished 13-0 and topped number 1 in the AP top 25 poll for their only national championship in school history under head coach LaVell Edwards. And that was the year after Steve Young had left BYU before he headed into the USFL for a few years before he was picked up by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and then traded to the San Francisco 49ers in 1987 there. But the previous season, Baylor actually handed BYU their only loss during the 1983 season, in their first ever meeting between both of these schools. So they played in 1983 and 1984 and essentially robbed BYU of back-to-back unbeaten seasons when they beat them in 1983 and Steve Young's last year for the BYU Cougars. So certainly, it was a pretty good 2-year stretch between both of those schools there. And certainly Baylor was also coached under a pretty good legend in Grant Taft, who was kind of, I think it was either Grant Tiaft or Grant Taft. I can't remember if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he brought a solid reputation at Baylor as well, kind of developed in the Mike Singletaries of the world, kind of building that Baylor Bears defense that they've been known for their recent years, as well as some of the players that they've had in the past. And certainly, both BYU and Baylor over that course of time in the late 70s and 80s kind of, were 2 of the top schools in the NCAA during their stretches of time. And then as far as the Baylor Bears here, my last note here in this one, they ended last season as the number 5 ranked team in the AP poll last year after they won the Sugar Bowl for the first time since 1956. But that number 5 ranking, that was only the third time in Baylor's program history that the Bears finished the year within the AP top 10. Their first time they did it was back in 1951 when they finished number 9 ranked in the country that year. And in 2014, they were ranked as the 7th best team in the nation at the end of the 2014 season. Only the third time last year when they were ranked at number 5. That was the only 3 occasions for the Baylor Bears during that stretch. So that'll be a really fun game to watch later today. I think that's going to be late tonight. I think it's going to be 10:15 tonight here for the college football fans tonight. I'm not sure if I will stay up for the whole game, but I'm hopefully will watch till halftime. All right, so let's go ahead and let's preview our second matchup here to watch today. Hopefully this is going to be one of the better matchups here today between 2 SEC schools here, kind of mid-tier teams, but certainly both teams made their statements on opening weekend, including one of them between the number 20th ranked Kentucky Wildcats going against the number 12th ranked Florida Gators after their upset win against number 7th ranked Utah that Billy and I briefly discussed in our last broadcast. And that was a huge upset there for Florida and giving Billy Napier his first ever win as a Florida Gator head coach. And certainly Kentucky handled their business as well against Miami of Ohio in their first matchup in week 1 last week here. Going into this game, though, Florida is a 5.5 point favorite going into this matchup here against Kentucky, and Florida has held a significant advantage in this rivalry between both of these schools. This will be their 73rd matchup all time, but in the previous 72, Florida has a 53-19 record against Kentucky, so they hold a significant edge against Kentucky in that regard. And going into both their head coaches here, I briefly discussed about Billy Napier with his first head coaching victory for the Florida Gators, but he was a thorn, though, for a long time in the Sun Belt when I would be watching Appalachian State games and trying to catch maybe Coastal Carolina. He developed Louisiana into a really fun Sun Belt powerhouse school. He had a 40-12 record at the University of Louisiana before getting his first win at Florida last week. And he had a 2-1 record in bowl games for the Louisiana Raging Cajuns. And, certainly they had built their school up really well. I remember when they beat Iowa State. I don't know if it was last year or in 2020, but certainly, Louisiana, Appalachian State, and Coastal Carolina, they're starting to get some of the powerhouse teams in the Sun Belt to contend and hopefully maybe have some of them move conferences, especially with Old Dominion going from the Conference USA to the Sun Belt. It might be time for some of those Sun Belt schools to get attention from other conferences. And certainly Billy Napier put Louisiana on the map during his 4 years he had with them. And then for Kentucky's head coach, Mark Stoops, he kind of had a record-breaking performance against Miami of Ohio that I'll touch on in just a moment here. But Mark Stoops, going into his 10th year here at Kentucky, he has a 60-53 overall record with the Wildcats and a 4-2 record in his bowl games that he has competed in so far. So this is going to be a really fun matchup, though, between both these schools. Both these quarterbacks, Will Levis and as well as their Florida's dual threat quarterback as well, Anthony Richardson. It's going to be a fun matchup between those two quarterbacks here, but those won't actually be my 2 offensive players to watch here in this matchup here. My 2 offensive players to watch in this game, It's going to be wide receiver Tavion Robinson for Kentucky and running back Montrell Johnson for the Florida Gators here. Let's first start off with Tavion Robinson here, who had a really great game in his first game here for the Kentucky Wildcats against Miami of Ohio. He had 6 catches for 136 yards and passed one. Dale Robinson, who set the Kentucky Wildcats single game record for receiving yards last year. Robinson topped one Dale's mark that he accomplished in just his first game against the Miami of Ohio Redhawks with his performance he had against them. But another finding here in the transfer portal, though, for Kentucky, as well as some of these teams kind of plucking these receivers and offensive talent from the previous schools here. But in his previous 3 years at Virginia Tech, though, Tavion Robinson had 113 receptions for 1,555 yards and 9 receiving touchdowns. And he also proved himself as a big special teams threat last year for the Hokies as well. He had 25 punt returns for 328 yards and 1 return touchdown in 2021. Both the punt returns and the punt return yards both led the ACC last year in 2021 for Virginia Tech. So certainly you could say that was a big missing piece for Virginia Tech when they played Old Dominion last week, when their offense and really kind of their special teams kind of seemed lost last week. And certainly that departure of Tavion Robinson, that kind of hurt the Hokies' chances in that upset that Old Dominion pulled off last week in week number 1 here. And as good as Anthony Richardson's performance was last week against Utah, I'm actually leaning toward Montrell Johnson, as well as kind of like the other running backs that Billy Napier used in that matchup. I think he used like Trevor Etienne in that matchup as well, and he used like a 4-5 running back and quarterback set as far as the running game goes. It's just seemed like every time they put in a new running back in that game against Utah, they just were kind of chipping away at Utah's defense in that matchup here. But for Montrell Johnson in that first game against Utah, he had 12 rushes for 75 rushing yards and 1 touchdown. And he actually followed Billy Napier from Louisiana to Florida here. So Napier's kind of developing a little bit of a trust here with Montrell Johnson early. But during their stint they had together in Louisiana last year, Montrell Johnson had 838 rushing yards and 12 rushing touchdowns with the Raging Cajuns in 2021. That was the 3rd most rushing touchdowns in the Sun Belt last year, and he pulled off a 99-yard touchdown run against Arkansas State last year, becoming only the 13th player in NCAA history to have a touchdown of 99 yards. So certainly a select class there for Montrell Johnson to get in here. But I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how Will Levis and Anthony Richardson play in this game. I loved what I saw from Richardson in that opening game against Utah, but he's really had a really small sample size for myself and I think other draft scouts to see. I think a lot of them see the potential of him maybe being a first-round pick, but as the competition gets tougher, we'll have to see, how Anthony Richardson develops over the rest of this season against SEC competition. I'm not sure who else Florida has in their opponents here. I'll have to take a quick look at their schedule when Billy and I maybe hopefully meet later this next week. But hopefully, he can continue the trend going here against Kentucky here in this matchup in week 2. Taking a look at my 2 defensive players to watch in this matchup between Kentucky and Florida. For Kentucky, it's going to be a linebacker, J.J. Weaver, who I'll be watching for in this game later today. And in his opening game against Miami of Ohio, Weaver had 5 tackles, 3 solo tackles, 2 assisted, 1 tackle for a loss, and 1 sack in that game against the Red Hawks, as well as 1 forced fumble in that opening game for Kentucky this year. And then last year, he had a pretty decent year for Kentucky as well, with 34 tackles, 10.5 tackles for a loss, 6.5 sacks, 2 interceptions with 1 pass deflection and 1 forced fumble last year for the Wildcats defense. So again, kind of as I mentioned with Ben Bywater for the BYU Cougars, hopefully Weaver is going to hopefully build that veteran leadership on the Kentucky Wildcats defense, and we'll see kind of if he can solve the riddle that Utah really wasn't able to solve in that matchup against Florida in week number 1. I still remember that play when Richardson deked those 2 Utah defenders to get that 2-point conversion there. We'll see if Weaver can kind of solve the riddle of Anthony Richardson and the Florida Gators offense here later today. And then for the Florida Gators, we have a defensive back, Trey Dean III, in this matchup here that will be my player to watch for Florida. And he had a really nice game against the Utah offensive attack last week that just kind of didn't really seem to be in sync. And he was a big part of the Gators' defensive success in that matchup against Utah. He had 12 tackles, 6 of them solo, 6 assisted tackles with 1 tackle for a loss against the Utes in week 1. And in his previous 4 years, he's returning for a super senior season this year in his 5th year with Florida. Trey Dean had 174 tackles, 9 tackles for a loss, 4 sacks, 4 interceptions, 14 pass deflections, and 1 forced fumble with 1 fumble recovery in his previous 4 years with Florida. So again, another strong veteran leader on the Florida Gators defense here. And this matchup is going to really probably maybe be a similar score, I think, to the Utah against Florida game here. I could see this game kind of averaging between 50 and 60 points between both of these teams here. But you got to watch out though for both of these defenses here trying to develop their identities early on this season. Of course, Florida gave up 26 points to Utah, and of course, Kentucky handling their business against the MAC school, Miami of Ohio Redhawks. This will be more of a test for Kentucky's defense than it will be for Florida's defense, who looked pretty good against Utah, especially in that second half against the Utes. 2 last quick notes, though, on this matchup here, though, between Kentucky and Florida. Going into this matchup here, Mark Stoops, with his victory against Miami of Ohio last week, actually tied Paul Bear Bryant for the most victories of any Kentucky Wildcats head coach in program history. Stoops accomplished that in 113 games. Bear Bryant only needed 88 games to accomplish his 60 victories for Kentucky's program. And this year, Kentucky actually ended a really long stretch to really earn their respect as far as the college football program this year. As for the first time since 1978, Kentucky began the season ranked in the top 25. So it had been a long time for Kentucky to kind of get praise from the college football experts, and certainly seeing some of their big players like Will Levis, Tavion Robinson, J.J. Weaver, and many others that finally got Kentucky a little bit of respect. And we'll see if they can earn their respect once again here with a big-time performance here against Florida later tonight. And then my last note here was kind of an intriguing note as well. This will only be the 4th time in their history between Florida and Kentucky that both of these schools have played each other, with both of them being ranked in the top 25. The Wildcats' only victory in that period that they've played each other as ranked opponents came all the way back in 1950 under the legend Paul Bear Bryant, when they won by the score of 40-6, when Kentucky was the number 5 ranked team in the country that year, and Florida was the 17th ranked team going into that matchup. But that was the closest season that Kentucky had probably to a national championship in school history. They finished that year 11-1 after starting the season 10-0, and cracked their highest AP poll ranking in school history at number 3 in the country before they lost a late season matchup to a highly ranked Tennessee Volunteers team in their last game of the season. That cost them an undefeated season, but certainly that was their best season overall and possibly their best chance in program history to earn a national championship, but they fell just short in that matchup against Tennessee. That kind of cost them that chance at getting some national championship that bids that year in 1951. All right, so we got 2 more matchups here to break down here. I'm hoping to finish this up by 11:30 so I can hopefully watch Kirk Herbstreit and the guys make their picks. Hopefully they will be picking, those 2 matchups I just broke down here. It'll be interesting to see which direction they pull in those 2 games. I'm going to pull actually Baylor to take down BYU. I kind of trust Blake Shapen a little bit, even though they don't have their 2 top receivers. I kind of like what I saw from Blake Shapen in that championship game, but of course going against a tougher opponent in BYU is going to be a little bit tough, especially after taking down Albany in that week 1. But I like Baylor in that matchup, and then between Kentucky and Florida, I might wager Kentucky, I think, to pull off the upset there against Florida. I just don't know if Florida will be ready to play against another AP top 25 team after really, pulling out all the stops in that upset win against Utah, especially Utah, really blowing a chance there in that game with 2 chances inside Florida's 10-yard line twice in that second half, and they, didn't put that game in overtime, which certainly could have happened, or certainly Utah could have pulled it out if they had punched it into the end zone instead of throwing an interception to end the game, as that game did in week number 1 here. Let's go ahead and break down my last 2 matchups here in week number 1. Our third matchup here is going to be between the Iowa State Cyclones against the Iowa Hawkeyes in this game. Billy and I kind of joked about the Iowa and South Dakota State matchup here when we last met, but Iowa's entering this game, though, as a 3.5-point favorite against Iowa State in this matchup here. This will be the 66th matchup between both of these schools from the state of Iowa in this game here. Nice little in-state rivalry game that both these schools have developed, but Iowa has held a significant edge here in this matchup as much as Florida has handled Kentucky's business. Iowa has a 46-19 record going into this matchup against Iowa State. And then going into both their head coaches, we talked a little bit about Kirk Ferentz. Billy and I did last week. Certainly, he has done a stellar job here at the University of Iowa, going into his 24th season this year with the Hawkeyes, a 179-110 record so far in his tenure, and a 9-9 record in bowl games for the Hawkeyes so far in his fantastic tenure, really rivaling Hayden Fry for what Fry's accomplishments were during his stint at Iowa before Ferentz took over. And then as far as Iowa State's head coach, Matt Campbell, excuse me here, kind of something popped up about that. Then as far as Iowa State's head coach, Matt Campbell, though, going into this season, he had a pretty respected tenure going at the University of Toledo during his stint that he had with the Toledo Rockets. He had a 35-15 record at Toledo before coming to Iowa State, and he has a 78-49 record overall after both these teams won in week number 1. He has a 4-4 record overall during his stint as a college football head coach in bowl games. So again, another really fascinating matchup here, as going back to the in-state rivalry between both of these schools here. And taking a quick look at my two offensive players to watch in this game. Sir. Looking at my two players to watch offensively for both of these teams, I have a tight end Sam Laporta for the Iowa Hawkeyes in this game. Laporta, not a really solid game offensively for Iowa in their last game here, kind of going back on his old statistics here, but he had 95 receptions for 1,129 receiving yards and only 4 receiving touchdowns, though, in his previous 3 years at Iowa. But last year was a pretty promising year for Laporta, despite a couple of strange losses by Iowa late in the season after a really strong start. Laporta led all Big Ten tight ends last year with 53 receptions and 670 receiving yards in 2021. As I've mentioned to so many people, Iowa, a great reputation for offensive line, tight ends, defense, and certainly Laporta is going to hopefully be willing to join the ranks of some of the other great Iowa tight ends. Of course, we have a TJ Hawkinson for the Detroit Lions we'll be watching out for in week number 1. And we also have a couple of other matchups here. Sorry, just kind of a bit of a hiccup here on this computer. Sorry about that. But it will be interesting to see how Laporta handles his business this year. Hopefully will be a day 2 or maybe day 3 selection here if he has a promising season for Iowa after a bit of a rough start for Iowa offensively in that opening game against FCS South Dakota State. Then as for my Cyclones player to watch, this guy has kind of been, maybe you could say, a little under the radar with some of the bigger receivers in the Big 12 and the SEC and all the range here. My player to watch is going to be wide receiver Xavier Hutchinson to watch here for Iowa State in this matchup here. He became the first Cyclone to lead the Big Ten in receptions in back-to-back years in school history, but the first Iowa State player to lead the Big Ten in receptions, period, was Tyrone Waitley back in 1997. And in Iowa State's opening matchup, Hutchinson certainly made his statement with 8 receptions for 128 yards and 3 receiving touchdowns in Iowa State's opening matchup here. And he led the Big Ten individually in both the 2020 and 2021 seasons in receptions with 147 catches overall during his last 2 years at Iowa State. So a bit of a sneaky wide receiver that a whole lot of people have kind of really overlooked. But certainly, I'm going to be keeping my eye on Xavier Hutchinson's talent. I think if I remember correctly, he's a bit of a shorter receiver, about 5'7", 5'8", but certainly been a thorn in a big 10 opponents in his first 2 seasons there at Iowa State, and hopefully he'll be ready for a breakout 3rd season after a promising start in Iowa, in Iowa State's opening matchup in week 1. Then looking at my 2 defensive players to watch here in this matchup here, we have a linebacker Jack Campbell for the Iowa Hawkeyes in this matchup here. He led the NCAA last year with 83 assisted tackles in 2021, along with 140 total tackles last year. The total tackles, that was 1st overall in the Big Ten, 4th most in the NCAA last year for Jack Campbell. And he also had 2 interceptions, leading Iowa Hawkeyes veteran defense last year. And he had a really good start in his game against South Dakota State in that defensive matchup with 12 tackles, 5 solo, 7 assisted tackles, and 1.5 tackles for a loss against the South Dakota State Jackrabbits in that week 1 matchup between both of their schools. And you're going to get that when your score is only 7-3. Hopefully we'll see a little bit more points in this matchup between both these schools, especially from Iowa State here in this matchup here. Then my player to watch for Iowa State, kind of again, sort of another under the radar player, maybe a whole lot of people have not really mentioned about, with a defensive lineman Will McDonald coming off two really promising campaigns for the Cyclones defense. He actually led the NCAA with 10 and a half sacks in the COVID shortened year in 2020, along with 13 tackles for a loss and two forced fumbles. His 13 TFLs. That was the third most in the Big 12 that year in 2020. And last year, he led the Big 10 with 11 and a half sacks in 2021, which was the seventh most in the NCAA, along with five forced fumbles. That was second most in the Big 12 and fourth most in the NCAA last year. So again, just kind of with Xavier Hutchinson and Will McDonald, Iowa State kind of making their reputation known a little bit, especially with Breece Hall's performance that he had over the last few years, kind of really trying to build their program, to the same heights as Iowa has for so long. The last few years, Iowa State's really started to build a scary looking program, even though they are still in the mid-tier teams in the Big Ten. But certainly, for Ohio State and some of the other teams, facing off against Iowa State this year, I would have my cautions going against Iowa State if they can continue this success and hopefully maybe take down Iowa in an upset here against their in-state rivals in this matchup here in week 2. Two quick notes here on this matchup before we move into our last one here. Iowa State, certainly, has not had a whole lot of recent success here against Iowa in this series. Iowa State's last win actually came back in 2014, but the last time the Iowa State Cyclones had a winning season after beating the Iowa Hawkeyes was back in 2005 when they finished with a 7-5 record under head coach Dan McCartney. And McCartney had possibly the best success of any Iowa State head coach. He won 6 times against the University of Iowa in 12 tries during his tenure there at Iowa State, including a 5-game winning streak from 1998 to 2002. So certainly, as far as Matt Campbell goes here in this matchup here, hopefully looking to end the streak here by Iowa in this matchup here. And certainly Iowa has dominated this rivalry, as I mentioned, going into this matchup here. Iowa has a 46-19 record in their previous 65 matchups. Iowa's current winning streak so far at 6 games, that is tied with the second longest streak in this series between both of these schools. That previous streak was from 1916 to 1920, before a 13-year gap between both of these schools, and then they beat them in 1933. But their longest winning streak overall came during the Hayden Fry years for Iowa, when they won 15 straight games from 1983 to 1997. But we could perhaps see a changing of the guard here in this matchup here with those two players I pointed out for Iowa State, and certainly with Iowa only scoring a measly 7 points in their last matchup. It will kind of be a test of seeing, who is more hungry early on in this matchup to make their statement in both of their conferences, with kind of the outset of the Big 12 and the Big 10 here in this season early on. It's going to be interesting to see what happens here over the first few weeks of the season. All right, we got one more quick matchup to break down here, and then I'm actually going to be heading to lunch. Actually, I got some lunch plans here, but hopefully we will catch up once again here later next week for episode 16. Our last matchup here, going to the legendary USC and a Stanford rivalry between both of these schools, the 10th ranked Trojans against Stanford in this matchup here. USC going into this game as 8-point favorites. A little surprising there for only an 8-point favorite, but of course just a legendary rivalry between both of these schools and both of their great tenures, with the history between both of these programs here. USC going into this matchup, this will be the 101st matchup between both of these schools. The previous 100 at USC was 64, 33, and 3 during those matchups here between both of these schools here. Lincoln Riley, a fantastic tenure that he had at the University of Oklahoma with a 55-10 record. Hold on just 1 second. Sorry about that little hiccup there, but going back to Lincoln Riley, though, a fantastic tenure that he had with the Oklahoma Sooners in his previous 5 years before transferring to USC to become their new head coach with a 55-10 record there at the University of Oklahoma after winning his opening game against Rice with USC's matchup in week one. Only a 1-3 record in bowl games, though. It's probably going to be interesting to see how USC fares this year once they reach the postseason after a promising start, even though Rice has been a down FBS team for many, many years. It's been a long time since Rice has been relevant. And as far as Stanford's head coach, David Shaw, going into his 12th year here at Stanford, kind of some down years for Stanford over the last several years. And hopefully he's trying to right the ship here for the Cardinals this year for the Stanford program. Overall, though, 94-45 record in his tenure and a 5-3 record in bowl games since his tenure began at Stanford. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of the difference between, the veteran head coach and sort of the newcomer here to the Pac-12 after certainly seeing with USC and UCLA jumping ranks in a few years. We'll hopefully maybe see if Stanford can maybe give Utah and maybe Oregon a run for their money once the Pac-12 realigns again in a few years. We'll see what happens here with David Shaw this year for Stanford. Talking about my two offensive players to watch here really quick, we have a wide receiver, Jordan Addison, coming off a huge year last year for the Pitt Panthers. He became the third player from the University of Pittsburgh to win the Fred Biletnikoff Award, awarded, of course, the best wide receiver in the nation, kind of joined the likes of Larry Fitzgerald, as well as an early version of, can't remember what his first name was, but I think it was Brown, I think was his last name, was kind of a few years before Fitzgerald broke the ranks in 2003. But Jordan Addison joining the likes of the legend of Larry Fitzgerald and hopefully improving his stock this season after a nice opening performance against Rice in that week one game with 5 catches for 54 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And last year with the Panthers, before transferring to USC, he had 100 receptions for 1,593 yards and 17 receiving touchdowns, which led the NCAA last year with the receiving touchdowns. His receiving yards, though, was first in the ACC, and that was 4th most in the NCAA last year, and a nice start to his season against Rice. And we'll see how him and Caleb Williams, with their quarterback, hopefully trying to team up with each other as USC will handle against Stanford's defense today. And then for Stanford's quarterback, Tanner McKee, he will be my player to watch in this matchup here. Last year, a pretty solid season for the University of Stanford, 2,327 passing yards, 15 passing touchdowns, only 7 interceptions, so a 2-to-1 passing touchdown to interception ratio, but he completed 65.4% of his passes, which was the second best in the Pac-12 last year. And, got off to a promising start against, once again, an FCS opponent this time against Colgate, but he was 22 of 27 for 308 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns and 1 interception against Colgate in their week 1 win. And he also had a 138.7 passer rating for Stanford last year in 2021. That was the 6th best in the Pac-12 last season. All right, and then really quick, just last few notes as well as my 2 defensive players to watch here. For USC, it's going to be a linebacker, Shane Lee, who I will watch out for in their matchup today. Lee, in his last game against Rice, had 8 solo tackles, 2 tackles for a loss, and one of those interceptions returned for a touchdown. Rice's receivers just had hands like, butterfingers in that game, just like passes just deflecting off their hands and just like landing right into USC's defenders. It was just a rough game for the Rice Owls in that week 1 blowout against USC. But we also had 1 pass deflection against the Owls in that week 1 matchup there. But overall, in his tenure, he hadn't really had a breakout season in his previous 2 years. Really, his first breakout campaign came as a freshman at Alabama in 2019 for Shane Lee. He had 86 tackles, 6.5 tackles for a loss, 4.5 sacks, 1 interception, 2 forced fumbles, and 1 fumble recovery in his freshman campaign he had at Alabama in 2019. His last 2 years has kind of been lost years for Shane Lee, and hopefully he's trying to emerge as a leader on the Trojans defense this year, and he'll be my player to watch in this matchup against Stanford. And then my Stanford player to watch defensively is going to be defensive back Patrick Fields, who had 4 tackles, 3 solo, 1 assisted with 1 tackle for a loss and 1 sack in that opening game against Colgate. And of course, he's another player who kind of found the transfer portal this offseason as well, coming from the University of Oklahoma. His previous 4 years with the Sooners, he had 201 tackles, 12 tackles for a loss, 2 sacks, 3 interceptions, 10 pass deflections, and 1 fumble recovery as a real leader for the Sooners defense over those previous 4 years. And hopefully he's looking to continue to right that ship for the Stanford Cardinal this year as another era of the USC and Stanford rivalry unfolds here later today. And then just really quick, my last few notes here, and then I'm going to power down for episode 15 here. Stanford's longest winning streak going into this matchup here today. They've only won 4 games as their longest streak against USC in their history. They accomplished that feat from 2009 to 2012, kind of during the height of the Andrew Luck years there at Stanford, and USC's longest winning streak against Stanford in this rivalry here between both of their schools, and what actually happened to be 12 games from 1958 to 1969. And Stanford last year defeated USC as an unranked team, but Stanford's been no stranger to beating USC as an unranked opponent. Stanford has actually beaten USC 7 times in this rivalry's history as an unranked opponent, when the USC Trojans have been ranked in the AP top 25. But when you put the shoe on the other foot, when USC was an unranked team against Stanford, USC has only beaten Stanford 3 times as an unranked opponent. Of course, Stanford hasn't been, as dominant as USC has been in their history, but USC has only beaten Stanford 3 times as an unranked opponent, while Stanford has beaten USC 7 times. But kind of going back to that, one thing I said about USC's winning streak against Stanford, technically Stanford's longest losing streak against USC was when USC went 14-0-1 from 1976 to 1990. They basically went winless for 15 matchups against the USC Trojans in that stretch there. And then just kind of one final quick note on these two's rivalry. Only 1 time in this rivalry's history have both USC and Stanford played against each other when they were ranked in the AP top 10 when they were both really at the height of their powers. That came back also in 1951 when it was a 7th ranked Stanford squad against the number 6th ranked USC squad. And the Cardinals won that matchup by the score of 27-20. So those 4 matches will be my 4 to watch here in this really exciting week 2 one here. And I'll just go ahead and just break down the matches one more time. You have the 9th ranked Baylor Bears against the number 21 ranked BYU Cougars. That will be at 10:15 tonight. The number 20th ranked Kentucky Wildcats against the number 12 Florida Gators. That will be at 7 o'clock tonight. The Iowa State Cyclones against the Iowa Hawkeyes. That will be at 4 p.m. And the 10th ranked USC Trojans will take on the Stanford Cardinal at 7:30 p.m. tonight. So those will be my 4 matchups to watch here today. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in to episode 15 of 100 Years of the NFL, a historical journey. My friend Billy and I will hopefully be back later next week for episode 16 to break down the week 2 matchups here in college football, as well as the week 1 NFL schedule on Sunday and Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody. Enjoy watching at college and NFL football, and we will see you later next week. Have a good night, everybody.